Hey, good morning, everyone. In American Government and Political Science, I thought I'd put up a quick review of Chapter 9 uh, by popular demand. Some students have actually asked for it, and I'm a little bit behind on these video summaries. Um, but by way of discussion, it's about political parties, and it's often a topic of conversations I hold with my friends and students when I was back on campus regarding that. There needs to be more parties, or parties need to change in terms of being differentiated between more differing groups. We've got this two-party system. It's very limiting. People find it often very frustrating. But the reality is, it's here to stay. Not necessarily the two-party system, but political parties as a whole. I don't know if it's in this class, but in one of my classes, several students are doing papers on political parties and their birth and their evolution over time. Um, and when you look at that history, you quickly realize they're here to stay, because it's like anything else, especially in a large society like ours, or even in a small local community. There are always different interest groups. We're a pluralist society. We have different occupations. We have men and women, and we have different age groups, and we have different philosophical ideations and ethnicities and religions. And because of that, we often have different philosophical goals about what we think government should do or not do. And as a result of that, in order to recognize sort of a powerful position and how you can impact it, it's often got to be done through party politics. It's almost very nearly impossible, certainly on the state level and the national level, to have any success being involved in political activity unless you're in some ways willing to participate in party politics. And I'll give you my example for just a quick illustration of it. I recently, this year, actually thought very seriously about running for an office that's not quite statewide, but it's got a huge district. I'll even tell you the office because I'm not going to run for it. It's already passed, and somebody else got elected, and it's over. It's called the Governor's Council. And the reason why I was thinking about doing it is I could still maintain the teaching job because it's largely a part-time elected position. In the Governor's Council, their main function is to approve and give advice and consent on judicial nominees of the governor. It's kind of like on the federal level what the Senate does. If the president, whether it's Trump or Biden, they will pick people to be on the federal judiciary, and then the Senate either approves or rejects those candidates. That's a little different in Massachusetts. It's the governor that chooses the potential judicial picks, the judges, clerk magistrates, and the like. And it's the special constitution on the state level that created this thing called the Governor's Council. They meet usually once a week on Wednesday afternoons, and they vote on these uh, nominees for judicial offices on the state level. I thought it was very fascinating. Also, I was thinking about running. What's the first thing everyone told me I had to do? Well, of course, you have to raise money, you have to get organized, all that stuff. But when people ask me, what party are you running in? Because I've been notoriously flip-flopping on my party affiliation, and I'm not afraid to admit it. I'm a centrist. I'm kind of a middle of the roader, but I recognize that sometimes there's advantages of being one party or the other during certain kinds of political functions, whether it's for myself or my friends. If my friend's running in a primary against another opponent in a certain political party, my concern is they might not get past the primary position if they don't have support by a primary voter. I can't vote in their primary, whether it's Democrat or Republican, unless I'm a member of that party or an independent. You can do it as an independent. So so as this campaign was kind of gearing up to potentially take take a step forward, I was an independent at the time, and some of my Republican friends join a Republican Party, and the reason why is there's a lot of organizational benefit for it. Money flows to you, structural organizations on the community level. Each town has a Republican town committee, just like each town has a Democratic town committee. Funding will come through from different interest organizations that align themselves with the different parties, and you'll become sort of legitimatized through the process. And I had Democratic friends say the same thing. They both want me to join their different party, join this party. And I had one who, I don't want to say his political identification, but I'll give him credit for saying this. He said, Corman, I don't care which freaking party you join. Join a party. You're never going to win as an independent. You'll survive the primary, but you're going to lose in the general election because you won't maintain and be able to develop the name recognition, nor get the political machinery of the two parties to potentially work for you. Well, needless to say, I didn't run. A friend of mine did. I supported him in the primary, and he lost in the primary. He's all done. I just saw him in court last Friday, and he's still licking his wounds over because he spent an awful lot of money on it. But he did have a lot of political recognition from unions and other groups that were supporting his candidacy, and that largely came because he was identified with a political party. So political parties, where did they start? We know the early sort of birth of them. They've been throughout history. They've been everywhere in the world on some level that has a democracy, some form of democracy. Different people have different interest groups, so you align yourself with other people in order to gain power. I'm kind of a corny guy here, and I'm listening to union rallying music from the 1950s and 60s, and I like this is related to unions, but it can be the same for political parties. It says, I just love this line here. It says, there can be no power weaker than the feeble strength of one, but the union makes us strong. It's that kind of sense that through union inspiration, through the workers' blood shall run, and there's no greater power anywhere beneath the sun. I mean, it's a limerick, it's a song, it's designed to discuss that. But it's so true that by yourself, without, I know you got family, you got friends, you got other people that might meet you, support. But I even admit that because I'm involved in politics, I'll meet different candidates that are running for things, and I'll meet independents. And what do I think right away when I hear, oh, this is a person, they're running as an independent? Well, in a very local election, I might not think too differently about it. But if I hear they're running on it for a state legislative position, a state senator position, or a statewide position like the auditor or the attorney general, lieutenant governor, or governor, and I hear they're running an independent, what do I immediately think? And I'm not wrong by thinking it, that they probably are going to have a very difficult road to hoe. And I know this sounds terrible, but I don't want to think I'm going to waste my vote on a candidate that has no chance of winning. Wouldn't I be better at picking a candidate that, although may not be thinking nearly as closely as that independent candidate is with my own personal views, but isn't it better to have a half a loaf than no loaf at all? And if it's a close election between the Republican and Democrat, I might want to pick one of those two and have a more likely victory than picking this independent person who's really got a great mindset, maybe even I think is the most qualified. But because I know they're going to go down in flames as a result of their political identification, you pick a party. So parties are there for a reason. They serve political interests because groups get together and they identify like interests and they say, well, this party tends to be more related to what I think government should and shouldn't do, and therefore you either join them actively, or you support them in a general philosophical way. And party politics is very important in this country. It's not going to go anywhere. Like I said, it started before the country even began. They were over in England before we even started our own nation. But in our own nation, you can say the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, they were really focused on one issue, whether we're going to basically redo the Constitution in the form that we have today, or we're going to keep the Articles of Confederation at some level. And arguably, those were the two first political parties. But really identified political parties, well, the Federalists remain after the Constitution was ratified. The Anti-Federalists dissolved, but fragments of them and other groups came together and created something called the Jeffersonian Republicans, sometimes called the Democratic Republicans. Terrible term because it gets confusing to people. And they were the party in opposition against the Federalists. And we know, well, because of Jeffersonian Republicans, we know Thomas Jefferson was sort of the advent of the party, and the vision of his America was on his side. And the other side were the Federalists with John Adams and Hamilton and other people like that. And we know later these parties splintered into other groups. Eventually, the Federalists fade out of existence pretty much after Louisiana Purchase. And we know the Republican Democrats splintered and became one is the Democratic Party, really under Andrew Jackson. And then the Whigs developed, which ultimately splinter groups of them became the Republicans. But since really after the Civil War, we had two major parties. And what's interesting about even those two major parties, have they kind of ebbed and flowed in between philosophical ideologies that we can't say that the Republicans of the 1880s are the Republicans of the 1980s. Absolutely not. Very different group, because they do change and evolve based upon political changes in dynamics and philosophy. It does change. Like in the 1880s, the radical Republicans were really pushing for equal rights for recently freed African Americans, and they were considered very, very progressive as a party. That group largely dissolved, but at the turn of the century, late 1800s, early 1900s, African Americans in significant blocks identified themselves with the Republican Party. Today they don't. Because of the Depression of the 1930s, the Democratic Party started advocating for principles and economic policies that flow down to those groups that were struggling financially, economically, and with discrimination. And it was the Democratic Party that started to seemingly take that cost. Not the whole Democratic Party, but more the northern and progressive wings of the Democratic Party. Democratic Party has often been fragmented in regional sections. Sometimes the Southern Democrats, called Dixiecrats, splinter the party. But it's fascinating how some people say, I'm a Republican, I'm the party of Lincoln. Well, that might be true on some levels, but on other levels, the party may well have changed. And just like saying, I'm a Democrat like Andrew Jackson, I think a lot of the Democrats today would reject a lot of the things that Andrew Jackson represented. So, and some of the things they would still like. It's very complex. But the advent of the parties, interest groups are the next chapter. What are interest groups? We all are. Everyone says, I hate interest groups. I meet politicians all the time. So we got to put an end to interest groups. We're all in interest groups. As a teacher, my union advocates for better wages for us. Is that an interest group? Sure it is. Are people that are trying to save the environment, are they an interest group? Sure they are. Are people out trying to protect children from abuse or neglect, are they an interest group? Sure. Any group that gets together to try to promote a policy on, no matter how meritorious or how selfish, it's an interest group. Some are obviously very meritorious and very much applauded. Others are seemingly very, very selfish and go oriented towards a very selfish group interest, arguably. So political parties, the unique organization, they really help the electorate, that sounds like a toilet, the electorate identify who they should vote for. And one thing I do recognize that the party processes do is through the primary, we weed out through the Democrats last time, I don't know what it started off like 20 candidates, then it gets whittled down to about 8, and then it gets whittled down to 2 or 3, and then one ultimately emerges as a Democratic nominee. Same thing happened to the Republican Party. When the previous election, we have a party in power. So this last election, only a couple of handful, Bill Weld of Massachusetts, for example, took on Donald Trump. He went nowhere. But the party in power tends not to have an opposition for the candidate. But when Trump ran back in 2016, there were many Republicans that were running, and the field gets whittled down through the primary process. Ideas and principles and theories get bantered about, and the party body politic, the two political realms through the primary schema, if you will, make our two primary candidates to vote between. At one time, now we vote as a ticket. At one time, if you want to do a little history, it might be on a history test. The Electoral College wasn't clear when you voted who you voted for president or vice president. Usually it was kind of understood that if you had a ticket, the second place person of your party would become the vice president. But we know Aaron Burr tied in the Electoral College with Thomas Jefferson, and Aaron Burr, being Aaron Burr, said, well, I'm not going to give up the chance to be president. Let's throw the thing into the House of Representatives, which the Constitution mandates. And it took quite a while, but they finally, a lot of tie votes came out of that between the two. Eventually, Alexander Hamilton, who really disliked Thomas Jefferson, but hated Aaron Burr for good reason. Aaron Burr kills him later in a duel. Alexander Hamilton at least said, hey, Thomas Jefferson's got some principles, if you will, and he's a competent guy. So and he swayed members of the House to basically put Thomas Jefferson in the presidency. We know where the 12th Amendment to the United States Constitution came about later on. So now when we vote for the president, you don't vote for the vice president on a different ticket. Every so often I argue with somebody saying, I want to vote for this person for president, but I want to vote for this other person for vice president. It doesn't work that way. That's why you never hear anybody at a national level going out and saying, I'm running for vice president. They don't do that. They just hope to get enough credibility and stability and believability that after they run a decent race but lose, they think they can draw votes to the actual presidential candidate. But the political party process, I always found it fascinating. Again, I've been a Republican, I've been a Democrat, been an independent. I tend to think most independently. I think, I think policies don't necessarily have to be related to a party if they think they're going to do the best for, my family and my community and all that kind of stuff. And I think most people actually think like me, but also most people recognize that they probably affiliate more often than not with one party or another. My father was a Democrat his whole life, but I think he voted probably mostly Republican because of certain connections to interest groups that he was involved in. He was a big union guy. Union people tend to gravitate more towards the Democratic Party, at least historically, than the Republican Party, which is more pro-business. And because of that, my father would often support Democratic candidates at their inception, but on a national level, my father almost always voted for guys like Ronald Reagan and George Bush. My father's dead now, so I don't know when the last time he got the vote. And people like that. I think the last Democrat my dad probably voted for was, I wonder if he voted for Lyndon Johnson, but I know he voted for John F. Kennedy. But prior to that, he's a kind of a middle road. So party politics doesn't always mean that much to many people. It's on a local level it might, and that's the other thing you got to distinguish. The national level has become more salient to people because of the way the media and the internet work now. We want our local politicians to represent what the national level is reflective of. At one time in history, I think at a local level, usually party politics didn't matter nearly as much. It was about, are we going to build that new school? Are we going to fix up our roads in our community? Are we going to spend the money or not? Are we going to create that new ballpark? Those kind of things really shed a little bit of the party politic identification. Usually it wasn't that important. I know when I was a Sturbridge selectman, I didn't know what the other four, well, I knew what one of the candidates was because he was in the party I was in, because I ran as a party candidate, because I thought it would give me an advantage. I didn't know what the other three selectmen were on the board, what their party affiliation was, and I couldn't tell by the way in which they voted. I had to look them up to figure out what party they were on, and that's used to be how it was on the local level. Now it's party identification. We've become very polarized. You're either in one camp or the other, and it's hard to stay in the middle because you can't get allegiances from different groups. And some people say that's very healthy because it clearly identifies who you are and what you stand for. Other people say, well, it's not healthy because it creates a lot of acrimony and hatred, because if you're not on my side, you must be therefore evil. And there's some truth to this polarization. There's no question about it. You're either I'm right and you're evil. It's no longer, I believe I'm right and I don't think you're right, and let's try to find a compromise. We've lost a lot of what we call bipartisanism, and I'll put a question on the test for bipartisan absolutely in the next test. So both of these party systems, as they got stronger and stronger and developed more and more, and Andrew Jackson's the one that I don't want to blame him and give him credit for it because it's actually a beneficial thing. They created a system of unbelievable organization because the party helps so much in creating volunteers and money especially today, can put people into public. If the public doesn't know who you are, you're not going to get elected. And if they do know who you are, and if you have slick media campaigns, you can look very, very talented and gifted and energized to go and take office. And without the public machine, the party machinery behind you, very, very difficult. So I think political parties are here to stay. And every so often, a third party will try to rear its head. Never in the history of our country have they done anything other than be an upset party, meaning they take away votes from one candidate to another. A perfect example is the one that kind of came close was the Progressive Party, or the Bull Moose Party of 1912. I don't know if there's any of the buttons behind me are the Progressive Party. It usually has just a moose on it, and sometimes it says 1912 underneath. And that was really the party of Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt served the end of the McKinley administration after assassination, got elected in his own right. And then he basically picked successor, his good friend, William Howard Taft. But then he was watching Taft as president, and he started disagreeing with some of the things Taft did or didn't do. So he decided he wants to run again. He knew because of party politics and the party in power, they were going to support Taft, the Republican Party was. Well, Teddy Roosevelt's not going to run as a Democrat because they have Woodrow Wilson on the ticket for the Democrats. So he creates his own party, basically. And because he has enough of a following, and he's a big character in American history, he nearly pulls it off, but he comes in third. He actually comes in second. He got more votes than William Howard Taft, but what did it do? It basically killed Taft and basically guaranteed an unknown candidate for the most part, giving Woodrow Wilson the victory. So he was really a spoiler more than anything else. So we've had other spoilers. You can argue that. I don't know if you're in as an independent or as a Green Party candidate. Now I can see his face, but I can't. I think there's a picture right in the book. He wrote a book called Dangerous at Any Speed about the Corvair back in the 1960s. I met him before, and I can see there's Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader didn't get that many votes, but he got enough, people argued, to make sure Al Gore, because people that voted for Nader, if Nader wasn't in the candidacy, would likely have been the next closest in terms of political ideology, would have been Al Gore in the Democratic Party. And Al Gore lost the Electoral College vote because of, I think, states like Ohio and Florida by a razor-thin margin. Third-party candidates are largely, I hate to say it, spoilers. But they sometimes also force the party to what? If there's a third-party candidate, it's getting 10% of the vote. That's a lot on the national level. And the reason why they're getting the votes is because they have a certain political ideology that my candidacy doesn't seem to be catering to. What will my candidacy probably do? Maybe start positioning yourself more in alignment with those political views. A lot of people say Hillary Clinton had to do that. After the primary, she defeated Bernie Sanders, a very progressive liberal. And Hillary Clinton felt that, boy, Bernie Sanders had a shockingly good campaign, nearly pulled it off because of the progressive liberal message that he had. So Hillary Clinton had to move more left, she thought, and I think most people did think she had to move more left in order to win the general election. And a lot of people think that Bernie Sanders candidates, followers didn't think Hillary moved far enough, and they didn't support her in the numbers they supported Bernie Sanders. But Bernie Sanders never ran as a third-party candidate. He always runs as a Democrat at the national level, but he's not. He's been a socialist, but we know he's an independent while in the United States Senate. Things I'm looking for in the book. Yeah, third parties. You guys can get all excited about. This guy named Evan Falchak from Massachusetts. He started a third-party candidacy here in Mass in order to be put on the ballot. He had to get, I don't know, it was 2%. They got 2% of the vote. Therefore, the party was recognized. But about a year later, he went and he joined the Democratic Party and dissolved the party completely. They're very short-lived. They just, no matter how excited people get about them, they just don't go anywhere. And then people talk about, what about the progressives? What about we create the Green Party and all these other parties? They tend to either not have enough broad enough appeal because they're focused on one issue like environment or equity or justice systems or something like that. And they tend to just get the real strongly committed people in those positions who aren't afraid, I guess you could say, to be the spoiler and fully recognizing you're not going to get elected. Libertarian parties are another perfect example. We talk about the two-party system. That's what we're definitely down to. We live in a polarity voting. You need to know about that a little bit. Straightforward in the book. There are some states that have runoff elections. Campaign, I tell you, if it isn't for money and organization, I don't know how anybody gets elected on the state, statewide level or certainly the national level. I'm just looking at different things. Yeah, they talk about the evolution of the parties, how the Republican Party, some of the people that identify with them over fiscal matters would change to the Democratic Party because they were more socially progressive than some of the other more evangelical parts of the Republican Party, because you can't block people and just say you're a Republican and therefore these are all your views. There's different subgroups within them. In the Tea Party, although there is a party called the Tea Party, most of them join the Republican Party for actual political activity. That branch of the Republican Party has certain values based upon small government and very low taxation and religious freedoms. There's other members of the Republican Party, the so-called Grand Old Party, much more about fiscal responsibility and very low taxes, and so they identify with the Tea Partiers on that issue, but they're not necessarily evangelical supporters of evangelical religious dogma. And so even within the parties, there are fragmentations. I know within the Democratic Party there is right now. It's between the very, very progressive wing of the party, people like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio out of New York, Cortez, I think, AOC. That's the liberal branch. Then you have the very moderate branch of the Democratic Party that actually won the election. People like Biden are kind of the middle road Democrats. The party's split, and both parties are split internally. And at some point, that's arguably why the polarization is occurring, is because in order to get success in either party, you have to be further out on the wings. There's no longer this sort of centrist. And actually, there was arguments in the 1950s that the Republican and Democratic Party were almost indistinguishable on many issues. Very fine distinctions between the two. There wasn't this strong distaste and strong absolutism about the different values that are going in there. And I can tell you during the primaries, conservative and moderate Democrats are having a tough time winning primaries. It's the very progressive liberal wing of the Democratic Party does very well in the primaries because primary voters tend to be those that are most engaged in party politics. And on the Republican end, moderate and conservative, old school Republicans are having a very tough time winning primaries. It's the extreme right or the Tea Party element of the party that does well in the primaries. And it's a really strange dichotomy that's really developed over time. And most people are like me. They don't always vote the party. Why? if everyone always voted the party, we could just add up how many Democrats we have in the jurisdiction and how many Republicans we have, and we just say, well, we have more Democrats, so therefore they get the electoral college votes for the presidency, or therefore there will be a congressional member from the Republican Party as opposed from the Democratic Party because there's more registered Democrats in the first congressional district for Massachusetts. The reason why we don't do that is party affiliation for many of us isn't a death knell to us saying, I'm going to go cross party lines and support another candidate that I think is very good. For example, Charlie Baker here in Massachusetts, a Republican. Does he get a lot of Democrats to vote for him? Absolutely. He appeals to people's sort of sense of moderateness, and many Democrats are conservative, moderate Democrats. So party identification is an indicator of how candidates will vote, but it's not a absolute derivative of what an outcome of an election will be. And Charlie Baker is one of the most popular governors in the country, and we live in a state predominating with independents first, but in terms of party identification, Democrats. We have many more Democrats than we do have Republicans in Massachusetts, but we oftentimes have Republican members of the governorship because people are willing to cross party lines. Their identification with party tradition isn't so strong that they follow it like a religion. And that's one of the tests of political being savvy. How can I get people to vote for me outside my political identification? In fact, when I was going to run in a certain party. I wasn't going to put that on my signs. I wasn't going to put that in my literature that I was from that party, even though I was going to run as a Democrat. I was going to run as a Democrat. And the reason why is I don't want people necessarily thinking, well, he's going to run as a Democrat, so he must believe in certain policies. I want people to vote because I think I'm going to do a good job. And the job I was going to do is going to be very technical. It's about approving the governor's choices for judges. And I don't think it matters if you're Republican or Democrat to know what makes a good judge for the judiciary. It's people who are compassionate and fair and have integrity and can apply the law objectively and blind to people's ethnicities and race and economic status, and to have fair resolutions in a civil environment for our legal disputes. I don't think that's a Republican ideology or a Democratic ideology, but I also wanted to win the election. And I think people sometimes get a little turned off if you push too much that, hey, I'm running from this party. How about just some Jim Corman? I'm running for this position. I think that has a certain degree of salience or popularity out there in the public. I think party politics is very dangerous. And I just went by, I'll give you an example this morning. I just went by even though the election's over, there's a huge Trump rally in Sturbridge of all places. I was surprised. I live in Brimfield, one town over, but I go into Sturbridge for everything. My kids live in Sturbridge. My adult kids, they have their own houses there. And I'm driving through and I was really shocked at how big this Trump rally was. So I'm driving by and I'm amused. They got these huge flags and a big festival. But then I was watching, because I couldn't help, I had to stop and watch for a little while. From the other side. I don't want to look like I was a party to any of it. I was watching, but I was amazed at how many people were shouting, racial slurs to the Trump supporters, and the Trump supporters, giving it right back to people. These people all hate each other. That to me is what worries me about party politics and about political identification is, man, do we hate one another if we're not on the same page? And that's sad, and I think that's really unfortunate. I'd rather go back to I was never alive in the 1950s, so I wouldn't know what it's like. But I remember growing up, and even in the 1980s, where Tip O'Neill from Massachusetts became the Speaker of the House. He had the role what Nancy Pelosi has right now in the Congress. Very, very powerful politician named Tip O'Neill, right here from Mass. He was running the Democratic legislature, the Congress, the House, I should say, when Ronald Reagan was president. He's a Republican. These two guys would hang out and they would disagree on a lot of stuff, so stuff would come to loggerheads and not necessarily move forward. But they did it with a certain degree of civility. And when they could find, hey, we got to keep this country moving, let's figure out where we can compromise, they did so fairly successfully. And I like the fact that the book puts a picture of the two of them together, two guys, very different men, that they found an ability to compromise. And those were the good old days. I think now today, I meet people that are, and I've had it happen before where, one of my good Republican friends, Democratic friends are together, and they'll just in conversation will come up, oh, you're a Democrat. Right? All of a sudden you just feel this like chilling effect, like people can't be in the same room anymore because they're from different political parties. And I always feel like I'm the hub of the wheel, meaning I have spokes coming out of me in terms of friends and allegiances. I'm all over the place with friends. I think I can get along with everybody, but man, other people don't. Right? it's really sad. And I think most of you guys probably feel it's sad too. But I guarantee you, many of you have very strong political views, whether it's more progressive and liberal leaning or conservative and Republican leaning, and yet you're going to say you're fair-minded about things and you want to do it based upon policy. But we tend to have a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to when people have an identification as a Republican or a Democrat. We have immediate misconceptions or preconceptions about the other side must be a little bit off their rocker or evil or mean or crazy, whatnot. Yeah, and it talks about the different parties. It's a long chapter. I thought it could have been a lot shorter how they talked about the different concepts, but I think they should have talked more about the polarization that in order to get in office, it seems that especially on the national level, you have to be a Republican, you have to be a very rightist Republican, you have to be right on the tangent in order to get in as a Democrat. You have to be very liberal. People in the middle row just don't make history, it seems, and that's one of my favorite bumper stickers about feminism. My ex-girlfriend was a very strong feminist, and I loved her bumper sticker in her car, and it used to say, "Quiet women don't make history." But isn't it true that also moderates, they make history? Maybe in times of national calamity, a moderate come forward and do some very heroic things in leading the government or the people through a very difficult time. But when you think about it, it are those people that have very strong positions about where to take the country that tend to get the headlines. Moderates just, let's go see a moderate movie tonight. No, you want to go see something really scary or thrilling, right? We're on the fringes when it comes to politics in terms of what the media pays attention to. Moderate voices, they're just an afterthought. They just don't get a lot of street cred. And some people say this is bad. And why is it bad? Because we're so polarized. You get the Congress that's split. Like right now, we have a Senate that the majority is in the Republican Party. We have a House that's in the Democratic Party. And then we have a president soon to be elected, or he's elected, but technically not certified yet, but it looks like it's going to be Joe Biden, who's a Democrat. Will there be possibly logjam, meaning laws can't get passed, things can't get done, budgets can't get approved? Yeah, that's true. And a lot of people think that's disgusting. It really shows because of polarization, our government becomes ineffective. I'm going to be a little bit of a dissenter on that. I think that's what our framers sort of intended, that if there isn't a national consensus on where we should be going, maybe we should just keep the laws as they have them. The problem is when it comes to running the national government and you can't pass a budget from year to year and it's going to shut down, that's where it becomes a real problem. But in terms of always feeling we always need new laws, sometimes I think we need less laws. So I'm not so sure that the government was designed to always be just moving stuff right through. I think sometimes because there's dissension, it shows that maybe there doesn't have a necessity to change in a certain way right now, and maybe we should keep what we have. And the book does the causes of polarization. I think the book does a kind of a poor job on it because there is no easy answer to what causes polarization. It's our ideology, it's what our families believe in, but I think it's just something going on in society. Maybe because the media is in our face 24/7, and I don't mean media like news, but people watch blogs and videos and music. Everything just seems to relate to telling us what to think and do, and it's just a strongly held belief, and we get very, very entrenched in those concepts. The book does talk about gerrymandering, and I want to put that on the test because it's an interesting phenomenon on the state and local level. Gerrymandering is actually named after our former government, Elbridge Gerry, and he in the legislature created maps for the state rep seats and the congressional seats in our state based upon such a way to keep him and his cronies in power. It goes on everywhere. It goes on a lot in the South. It's allowed, believe it or not. It's actually legal in some states, provided you don't do it to disenfranchise people because of their race or ethnicity. But if it's trying to, what we call gerrymandering, the reason why I call it gerrymandering, like I said, Elbridge Gerry was his name, and they call it gerrymandering because it looked like a salamander. So gerrymandering was the salamander-y looking district that didn't, you think that a jurisdiction should have a nice little section all through the state, kind of like even blocks, but it's based upon population. The populations have to be equal under a famous case that came out of the United States Supreme Court in 1964, and it's called Reynolds v. Sims. It'll be on the next test. Or on a test. Reynolds v. Sims said that you can't have one district having congressional seat in the House of Representatives You can't have one seat that has, hundreds of thousands of citizens, and then another seat only has just 100,000 citizens. That's inequitable. One congressional person becomes much more powerful based upon per capita distribution. So you have to set up your districts to have close to equal population. That's because the Supreme Court said one vote, one person is really what it has to equate to. However, that doesn't change anything for the U.S. Senate because they're statewide anyways. But in terms of the congressional seats, people have, in different jurisdictions, have made very creative maps that don't look very logical. And the reason why they're not logical is they're trying to get certain communities and say I'm a liberal Democrat, and you're going to want to create a map that if I'm the incumbent and you want to keep putting me back in, my party wants to keep me putting back in because I'm going to support party politics. Um, they're going to make a map to really capture as many people that seem to be progressive Democrats in that jurisdiction to make a jurisdiction that's representative of that. I don't know how well it works, but there's a long history of it, and people get in trouble for it to this day because many states have banned it, that district maps can't be drawn to give advantage to one candidate or another, but we know they all do it and people empowered do it. Now, the one thing I want to talk about that I do think is a negative of politics is that political structure. So say I come in as I'm a freshman congressman from Massachusetts, House of Representatives, I get elected. I'm going down to Washington. I'm all loud and proud, and I want to represent the people back here in the first district of Massachusetts. And then I get down there and I find out that Nancy Pelosi is the Speaker of the House. What is the Speaker of the House? That's the party in power in the House of Representatives picks their leader. So the number one leader in the House is the party in power. It's the Democrats right now. They pick Nancy Pelosi. We call her the Speaker of the House. So she's kind of in charge of the Democrats that are in the House of Representatives. What do I mean by in charge? She has a lot of control over what committees I get on, what legislation will come forward and not come forward, and whether or not basically I'll have a say in how things get done in the House of Representatives. If I vote for somebody else other than her to lead, or I don't follow her lead on what she tells me what to vote on certain legislation, because that's what the Democrats should do. I can be sanctioned, not sanctioned like in terms of a fine or anything like that, but I can find myself out of party favor and I won't get the good committees. I won't be able to get my pieces of legislation put forward, and I'll become basically really a bump on the log down there. And this happens to people. People are surprised by this. And then the next one down is called a whip. I hate that term whip, but basically someone is supposed to whip up support for the, so Nancy Pelosi will be the Speaker of the House, and then there will be a majority whip. There is no majority for the Republicans in the House of Representatives right now, so all they have is what we call a minority leader. And then they have a minority whip under that person, again, to make sure they vote consistent with what Republican ideology. Same thing happens in the Republican Party. The Republican Party wants you to go a certain way on a vote, and you disagree, you're going to find yourself in disfavor with the party, and you'll be demoted on committees, office space, the amount of legislative age you get. It's real. It happens on the state level as well. It's a real interesting phenomenon. On the Senate level, we call the leader of the Senate just that, the majority leader. And right now it's the Republicans, and it's Mitch McConnell from Kentucky, who is the majority leader. The minority leader is Chuck Schumer, the Democrat, who's in the minority party in the Senate, and he's from New York. These people dictate who gets on what committee and the powers that'll be had. Very powerful positions are created in government, not simply by being elected, but also by the political party's framework of governance. And so it's very difficult that if you come in and you think you're going to be a maverick and you're going to cross party lines to support some Republican initiatives or do some things that are outside of what the Democratic Party platform is, you might find yourself being odd man or woman out in terms of political favor. And that's some of the tension that's going on right now between AOC, Alexandra Ortiz-Cortez, and Nancy Pelosi, because they've differed on some things. And Nancy Pelosi basically says, hey, I'm in charge of the party. You're going to be, and Alexander, to give her credit in terms of chutzpah, she'll come out and just call her out and say, I'm not agreeing with this, and look what they're trying to do to me as a result of it. They're trying to basically, sideline me and put me into some lower level. And that does happen. And so politics is very complex, and that is, I think, a flaw in the party system. I like to think if I went to the House of Representatives or went to the U.S. Senate, I would have just as much voice and as much say and as much power as every other senator there. But the reality is party politics can control the dynamics of how things work within those institutions. That's scary, in my opinion. That happens at the state level as well. I know back in the day, a good friend of mine was a state rep from my community here, and he voted for somebody to be Speaker of the House that lost. And he had this really nice office before that. Upon re-election, he literally was in some kind of basement thing with like a cubicle. And he was on these like really, I don't know, like the dairy committee or something like that, committees that he didn't have any interest in or any want to be on. And he wasn't the chairperson of any committees after that because he supported, it was like, it's a punishment. And it's understood that that's what happens. And that should discuss you because it discussed me. Disgusted him, certainly. He actually didn't run for re-election after the next term because he felt like he was useless um, in the House of Representatives of the state legislature. Video went a lot longer than I thought it would. I'll try to put up something next day or two for chapter. We're getting up there pretty far. Chapter 10, very related interest groups, but we'll get there. And I hope the video doesn't bore you too much.